It started with a simple $200 fine. A fine so small, most people would have just paid it and moved on. But for one homeowner in the Lakeview community, it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. About being pushed one time too many by a board that thought it could control everything, from the color of your mailbox to the way you lived your life. They thought a piece of paper taped to his door would break him. Instead, it sparked a chain of events that would turn their peaceful lakeside neighborhood into a battlefield. One that ended with a $2 million shock no one saw coming. How far would you go to stand up to an HOA drunk on power? The Lakeview Estates. Neighborhood had the kind of quiet charm people dreamed about when they thought of finally settling down. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and a lake so still it mirrored the sky, the kind of place where every mailbox looked identical. Every driveway was spotless, and every neighbor waved with a polite smile. For Daniel Hayes, it was supposed to be his sanctuary. After years of saving, he'd finally bought his dream home, a modest 2-story house that sat near the water's edge. He wasn't flashy, just proud. Proud of what he'd built, proud of the life he was creating with his wife, and proud of the little patch of peace he thought he'd found. Lakeview had rules, of course. Everyone knew that going in. "Keeps the place beautiful," the realtor had said with a cheerful grin as they signed the closing papers. Daniel hadn't thought much of it then. A few bylaws about grass height or where to park your trash cans didn't seem like a big deal. In a way, he even respected it. Order, structure, a sense of community. That's what he thought he was buying into. But beneath the manicured lawns and friendly greetings, there was something else. Something subtle, but always there. The watchful eyes. The whispered complaints. The sense that someone was always checking, always measuring your life against a rulebook no one actually remembered agreeing to. It started small. A note in his mailbox about leaving his trash bins out too long. Then another one, this time about his shed being non-compliant with the HOA's approved color palette. Each one was polite, almost overly so, but the message was clear. Someone was watching. And someone didn't like what they saw. Daniel brushed it off at first. Everyone had bad days. Maybe the HOA president was just doing her job. But he couldn't ignore how quickly the letters became part of his life. Every time he checked the mail, he half expected another envelope marked with that familiar Lakeview HOA logo. It was like living under quiet surveillance. No alarms, no confrontations. Just constant reminders that peace here came with a price. Still, Daniel tried to stay positive. He joined the neighborhood cleanup day, mowed his lawn twice a week, even attended an HOA meeting, though he left feeling like an outsider among people who smiled too wide and talked too softly about maintaining standards. Then summer arrived. And with it, Daniel's favorite pastime, fishing. The lake behind his house wasn't just a view. It was the reason he'd chosen this home. Early mornings with a cup of coffee, casting a line into the misty water, felt like therapy. It was his quiet ritual, his reset button, after long work days. But apparently, not everyone saw it that way. It was mid-June when he noticed the first sign, a neatly printed notice posted on the community board near the mailboxes. Fishing in Lakeview property waters is restricted to authorized residents with HOA approval. He remembered pausing, frowning at the words. Authorized residents? Approval. He lived on the lake. Who else would it be for? A week later, the notice appeared again, this time directly on his door. Only this one was addressed to him personally, complete with a warning of potential fines for continued violations. Daniel couldn't believe it. Fishing in his own backyard? He thought it was a mistake, maybe some mix-up with new policy changes. But when he emailed the HOA, their response was swift and curt. The lake is community property, and all recreational activities must comply with HOA oversight. Continued non-compliance will result in fines. It was absurd, but also strangely predictable. Lakeview's HOA had a reputation, one he hadn't fully understood until now. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were policing lifestyles. Still, Daniel tried to reason with them. He showed up to the next meeting, calm but firm, asking for clarification. What followed wasn't a discussion, it was a performance. The board members smiled politely, spoke in vague legal terms, and dismissed his concerns with the kind of condescension that said, "We've already decided how this goes." When the $200 fine notice arrived a few days later, Daniel didn't get angry right away. He just stood there, staring at the paper, feeling that quiet weight in his chest. It wasn't about fishing anymore, asterisk. It wasn't even about the money. It was about being told once again that in Lakeview Estates, control mattered more than common sense. That's when something shifted. The neighbors still waved as he drove by. The lawns still gleamed under the sun, and the lake still shimmered like nothing had changed. But for Daniel, everything had. Because behind that calm surface, he knew a storm was coming. And when it hit, Lakeview HOA would never see it coming. Daniel didn't realize how quickly a simple $200 fine could turn into a war. At first, it seemed like a single misunderstanding, a bureaucratic overstep that could be cleared up with a few polite emails. But the more he tried to reason with the Lakeview HOA, the more he began to understand what he was truly up against. The board wasn't just enforcing rules, they were defending power. Within a week of the fine, a second letter arrived. This one was colder, more formal, citing continued noncompliance with community guidelines and warning that further disciplinary action could follow. The letter accused Daniel of disrupting the community harmony and setting a poor example for other residents. The irony was bitter. His quiet mornings with a fishing rod had somehow become a threat to the peace. He walked around his house that evening, the paper trembling in his hand, and looked out over the lake. The same lake that had drawn him to this home, the same lake he'd worked late nights and sacrificed vacations to afford. And now, he wasn't even allowed to touch it, not without their permission. That was when the notices began appearing more frequently. First, a reminder that his trash bins had been left visible for too long. Then, a citation about a supposed oil stain in his driveway. Each message arrived in the same tone, cold, impersonal, and vaguely threatening. It was clear now, this wasn't coincidence. Someone on that board had decided to make an example of him. He started noticing the subtle signs of scrutiny. Cars slowing down when they passed his property. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact. Even the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda Myers, seemed to linger a little too long at the end of his street during her morning walks. She'd glance toward his house, clipboard in hand, like a warden inspecting a cell block. Daniel tried to play by their rules, hoping compliance would earn him peace. He repainted his shed, kept his yard immaculate, and even stored his fishing gear inside the garage. But it didn't matter. The letters didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. One morning, he woke up to find a bright orange tag posted on his front door, notice of violation. The claim? Unauthorized use of community property. Someone had taken a photo of him fishing again. And this time, the HOA was demanding not only another $200 fine, but also a review hearing to determine further penalties. That was the moment he realized this wasn't about rules. It was personal. He attended the hearing, sitting in a small, sterile meeting room at the clubhouse. The board members were lined up like judges, papers neatly stacked before them. Linda, seated at the center, barely looked up when she addressed him. Her voice was calm, deliberate, dripping with control. "Mr. Hayes, this is the third documented violation of Lakeview's property usage policy," she said as though reading from a script. "We've received multiple complaints from concerned residents." Daniel clenched his jaw. Concerned residents, he thought. Or maybe just Linda and her inner circle of rule keepers, the ones who thrived on control disguised as order. He explained his side, that the lake bordered his property, that no one was ever disturbed, that he'd fished there for years without issue. But the board wasn't listening. Their minds were already made up. The decision was unanimous. An additional fine and a formal warning of potential legal action for continued non-compliance. He left the room that day feeling cornered. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood, they were policing it, and Daniel had become their target. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew. A landscaper he'd hired suddenly backed out of their contract, claiming he didn't want trouble with the HOA. A delivery truck was reported for blocking the street near his home, resulting in yet another citation. Even small gestures like hosting his brother's family for a weekend seemed to attract scrutiny. A few days after their visit, he received a note warning about excessive street parking. It was suffocating. Every attempt to live normally was met with retaliation disguised as regulation. And yet, Daniel wasn't the type to back down. He began documenting everything, every notice, every email, every phone call. He started recording the times HOA vehicles slowed in front of his house. He kept a binder thick with evidence, knowing one day he might need it. The turning point came when he stumbled across the HOA's annual financial report, a document buried deep in their website. Out of curiosity, he skimmed through it, and that's when he saw it. Line after line of vague expenses, maintenance, administrative costs, consulting fees, all charged against the community fund. But what caught his attention was a series of payments to a private security contractor, totaling nearly $25,000 for the year. There was no security in Lakeview Estates, no guards, no patrols. So where was that money going? Something didn't add up, and Daniel wasn't about to let it slide. He started asking questions, quietly at first. He brought up the expenses. During an open meeting, only to have Linda cut him off mid-sentence, claiming that financial matters were handled transparently and in compliance with state law. The tone was dismissive, final. But the way the other board members shifted uncomfortably told him everything he needed to know. He wasn't the only one who thought something was off. A few days later, one of his neighbors, a quiet retiree named George, approached him in private. George had lived there for nearly 15 years and had seen the HOA's tactics before. "You're not wrong," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "They've been using community funds for personal projects for years. New landscaping, contracts, parties, even home repairs, all billed as community improvements. But no one ever fights them. Everyone's too afraid." That was all Daniel needed to hear. He spent the next few weeks digging. Public records, county filings, budget disclosures, anything he could find. The more he uncovered, the uglier it got. The Lakeview HOA wasn't just mismanaging funds. They were funneling them into private deals, all signed off by Linda and her board. And then he found it. The connection that would change everything. The lake itself, the one he'd been fined for fishing in, wasn't technically HOA property. It was deeded years ago as a shared easement between the HOA and the county, which meant the HOA had no legal authority to restrict access or issue fines for its use. They had fined him for something they didn't even own. That revelation hit him like a lightning bolt. Every warning letter, every fine, every condescending meeting, all of it was based on a lie. Daniel knew what he had to do. He contacted a lawyer, not a local one, but a firm known for handling HOA corruption cases. The kind of lawyers who made board presidents nervous just by showing up. Together, they compiled his documentation, the false fines, the financial inconsistencies, and the property deed records. What started as a folder on his desk soon turned into a case file several inches thick. Asterisk. When the meeting began, Linda Myers sat at the center of the long oak table. Her signature pearls perfectly aligned around her neck. She looked composed, confident, the image of authority she'd built for years. But the faint tremor in her voice when she called the meeting to order gave her away. She knew what was coming. Daniel wasn't alone this time. His attorney, a sharp, composed woman named Rachel, sat beside him, her briefcase neatly stacked with evidence. Across from them, the HOA's lawyer adjusted his tie, glancing nervously at the crowd gathering in the back. The homeowners had shown up in force. People who had once avoided eye contact with Daniel were now sitting behind him, watching silently, waiting for answers. Linda began with her usual control. "This meeting has been called to address the ongoing dispute between Mr. Hayes and the Lakeview Homeowners Association," she said, her tone clipped. "Our goal is to find resolution and restore harmony to our community." But Daniel's attorney leaned forward. "Harmony," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "My client has endured months of targeted harassment, false fines, and intimidation. And today, we're going to show exactly how this board has abused its power, not just against him, but against every homeowner in this room." The air shifted. Even the HOA lawyer looked down at his notes. Rachel opened the first binder. "Let's start with the fishing fines," she said. According to the HOA, Mr. Hayes was cited for unauthorized use of community property. But here's the problem. The lake isn't community property. She flipped a document onto the table, a county deed stamped and signed. The lake is classified as a shared easement under county jurisdiction. The HOA has no authority to regulate, fine, or restrict its use. Every single fine issued under that rule is invalid. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. Linda's smile faltered. "That's not Rachel," cut her off smoothly. "It gets worse. These aren't isolated mistakes. My client requested financial transparency from this board months ago and was ignored. So we conducted our own audit using publicly available records." She slid another document forward. "Over the last 3 years, this board has redirected over $60,000 in community funds to private contractors, all tied to individuals. Connected to the board president, landscaping, maintenance, security contracts that never existed." The murmuring in the audience grew louder. One man stood up, red-faced. "That explains the increase in dues last year." Linda's voice shook now. "These accusations are baseless. You can't just—" Rachel didn't even look up. "Baseless. Let's talk about this." She turned to a projector screen where Daniel connected his laptop. Within seconds, photos filled the wall, images of receipts, checks, and internal HOA emails. Asterisk. One of them, dated only 6 months earlier, showed Linda authorizing a $7,500 beautification expense, paid directly to a landscaping company owned by her nephew. A hush fell over the room. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Rachel spoke again, calm and deliberate. "This board has overstepped its authority, misused community funds, and targeted homeowners who questioned it. My client has every right to seek damages, and he intends to." Linda's composure cracked. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "This is slander," she snapped. "You have no idea what you're talking about. The HOA operates within its rights." Daniel finally spoke. His voice wasn't angry, just steady, quiet, and firm. "You fined me $200 for fishing? You called it a rule violation. But this was never about rules. You wanted control? You thought you could bully me like you've bullied everyone else in this neighborhood?" He turned to the crowd, his eyes sweeping across faces that had once avoided him. "They tell you it's about community standards, about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. But what they really mean is keeping you silent, making you afraid to question them." I was done being afraid. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence felt electric. Then someone clapped. It was soft at first, hesitant. But then another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause. The homeowners weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. Linda tried to regain control, banging a small gavel against the table. "Order! Order, please. This is not how—" But the board was crumbling. 2 members quietly gathered their things and left the room. The HOA's lawyer leaned toward Linda, whispering urgently. Her face went pale. Rachel closed her binder and stood. "Given the evidence, we'll be moving forward with a civil claim. Our firm will also be notifying the county's housing division of the HOA's financial misconduct. I strongly suggest this board prepares for what comes next." The crowd erupted again, not in chaos, but in realization. Years of silence, years of compliance, were breaking all at once. As Daniel stood, Linda finally lost the mask. "You think you've won?" she hissed under her breath. "You've just destroyed your own neighborhood." Daniel looked her straight in the eye. "No," he said quietly. "I just freed it." He walked out of the clubhouse into the sunlight, feeling the weight that had hung over him for months finally lift. Behind him, voices rose, homeowners demanding answers, shouting for resignations, calling for change. For the first time, the HOA wasn't feared. It was exposed. But that was only part of the story. 2 weeks later, the county launched an official investigation. What they uncovered went far beyond Daniel's case. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for, falsified maintenance reports, even conflicts of interest in property valuations. The Lakeview HOA, once seen as the model of suburban order, had become a headline scandal. Asterisk. Local news stations showed up at the entrance of the neighborhood, cameras rolling as reporters questioned board members who refused to comment. Linda was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it she'd resigned quietly the night before the story broke. Meanwhile, Daniel's attorney filed a civil suit seeking damages not just for the false fines, but for the harassment and emotional distress the HOA had caused. The figure stunned everyone: $2 million. It wasn't about greed. It was about sending a message. Daniel knew most of that money, if awarded, would go toward legal fees and community restitution, but that didn't matter. The principle was clear. The HOA had spent years controlling, intimidating, and exploiting the very people it claimed to protect. Now it was paying the price. Still, the real victory came a few days later, when Daniel received a letter in the mail. No HOA logo this time. Just a simple, typed message from one of his neighbors. "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too scared to. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it on his desk beside the first. Notice he'd ever received the $200 fine that started it all? That single piece of paper had once made him feel powerless. Now it reminded him of how power can crumble when someone finally pushes back. As the sun set over Lakeview, Daniel stood by the lake's edge, casting a line into the calm water. No rules, no restrictions, no permission slips. Just peace. The lake shimmered gold in the fading light, and somewhere behind him, the faint sound of hammering echoed through the neighborhood. A new sign was being posted near the clubhouse, one that read, "Lakeview Community Association, under new management." Because in the end, the HOA's $200 fine hadn't just backfired. It had rewritten the entire neighborhood's story. And the real payback? That was just beginning. The weeks that followed the public unraveling of the Lakeview HOA were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. For years, the community had prided itself on order lawns cut to regulation height. Fences painted in pre-approved shades of beige, mailboxes perfectly aligned like soldiers in a row. But now, that rigid perfection had cracks running straight through it. Cracks that let in something Lakeview hadn't seen in a long time: freedom. When the investigation officially concluded, the findings were worse than anyone imagined. County auditors confirmed what Daniel and his lawyer had uncovered: the Lakeview HOA board had embezzled nearly $80,000 in community funds over a 3-year span. Administrative costs had been used to pay for private landscaping, travel expenses, and consulting fees that never existed. Several former board members were subpoenaed, and the HOA's insurance carrier froze all operations pending legal review. The news spread fast. Local outlets ran headlines like "HOA Scandal Rocks Lakeview Estates, Homeowners Demand Accountability." A small story at first, it quickly went viral online.